I'm Skip Conover, and I'm going to be leading this Carl Jung Depth Psychology reading group. And tonight is the first session, so we have no assignments. And so what I'm going to do is, first of all, talk a little bit about Dr. Jung and his work and some of his basic ideas, and talk about what I plan to do over the next period of time. I'm trying to help people understand the self and the deep unconscious. Tonight I'm going to just talk about Dr. Carl Jung a little bit and about his basic ideas, some of his basic ideas. And then at the end of the session, I'll provide a reading assignment for next week, and then we can start talking about Dr. Jung's actual thinking. Now, Dr. Jung was one of the first people in psychotherapy with Sigmund Freud around the turn of the last century. And he worked for about 60 years. He wrote many, many books. There's 20 books in his collected works as they're currently published, and I'm told that there's going to be a new publication, and that new publication will have at least 26 books. I know that I have several books that are outside of the collected works right now. But the first thing I wanted to do was to talk about some of his basic ideas. And we're talking about depth psychology here. So the purpose of being interested in this at all is to understand the meaning of your life and to get down to the bottom of what it is that you are and that you're about in your life. And Dr. Jung felt that everyone was somewhat different. He once joked, "Bring me a normal man and I will fix him for you." And what he meant by that is that we're all normalized in one way or another. We're all taught to be good little boys and girls and eat our spinach and that sort of thing. And we rise to a time when we tend to rebel against such things, and that's when we start to become an individual. And so one of Dr. Jung's basic ideas is the idea of individuation, which is how you learn what it is that you're meant to be, what is the meaning of your life. And you could discuss it by analogy by saying something like every oak tree is an oak tree, but every oak tree is different. And every oak tree in its seed that starts the tree already has within it everything that it needs to become that specific oak tree. And so it is with us as human beings. We have everything in ourselves already as we are born, and we know, and our unconscious knows precisely how to make our brain, how to make our heart, how to make our lungs, how to make them function, how to make our blood vessels, and everything about us is already in the very first cells that join together in your mother's body. And that is all done unconsciously. And so Dr. Jung's purpose, the purpose in life as he saw it, was to show people how they could reach an understanding of what it is that their particular self should look like. And so he used a number of different techniques to get at that. And one of his ideas was the idea of an archetype. Now, an archetype in Jungian psychology means something that is instinctual, something that's instinctual. And so the most obvious archetype that we all experience one way or another is the mother archetype. When a woman has a baby, she knows what to do. She becomes certain things just emerge in her psyche that tell her what to do. And we as human beings are very thinking individuals, so we think a lot about what it is, and we can read books about motherhood and all that sort of thing. But in the animal world, the female doesn't have any training, doesn't have language with which to discuss how to become a mother, but they simply instinctually do. And so the first archetype that any of us really experience is the archetype of mother. And there are many, many archetypes. Joseph Campbell followed Dr. Jung in many respects and wrote many books on the topic of mythology. And we'll get into how that fits into Jungian psychology at some point here. But Joseph Campbell, in his most famous book, wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And what he meant by that is that there are thousands, potentially, of archetypes. You could be a policeman or a fireman or a soldier, and all of those have certain archetypal things about them. In the United States, a policeman wears a blue shirt, but just because I'm wearing a blue shirt doesn't mean that I'm a policeman. But nonetheless, where the uniform of a policeman would be part of the archetype of police. And so usually when I'm talking about archetypes at the very beginning, I talk about typically 4 that apply to men and 4 that apply to women. And in the men category, if you're familiar with the television program Star Trek, and especially Star Trek Next Generation, you may know of the character Wesley Crusher. Well, Wesley was the child archetype in that program. And so when we're young, before puberty typically, we are children. And in males, that normally leads to what's called the warrior archetype, where young men have a feeling that they want to go out and prove themselves in society. Now that could be through some sort of initiation. It can be by fighting some battle. It doesn't have to be a military battle. It can be a battle of earning a PhD or something like that. But it's obviously something that's difficult for that person. And so that is the warrior archetype. And in the next phase that men go through, typically, and this is also the reason why the warrior archetype is typically very young men. Being in the military is a young man's game. If you take an aircraft carrier, for example, typically the captain of the aircraft carrier is 45 years old, which by most standards is quite young, and yet that's the oldest person on the aircraft carrier, and the average age on an aircraft carrier, counting all the pilots and everything who are older, is the average age is about 20 years old. And so warriors tend to be very young. People can join the U.S. Marine Corps when they're 17, and if they do that, then they can after 20 years, retire when they're 37, 20 years later, and they're retired and earn half pay for life then. So that's the warrior type. And hello from Argentina. Isn't this is exciting? I'm glad you decided to check in with us tonight. So I'm talking about the archetypes, and I've talked about the masculine side, the child archetype, then the warrior archetype. The next archetype for men is the king archetype. And by that I mean man grows into a stage where he becomes a husband, he becomes the leader of his household, or at least men think they're the leader of the household. Maybe that's not always true, but we like to think we are sometimes. But men assume certain responsibilities around the household, and those are archetypal, and it's natural for a man to be responsible for bringing in the livelihood of a family. Although these archetypes are breaking down in more modern times, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of what an archetype is all about. And so after a man goes through the stage of raising children and all those things, which is typically the mature male archetype, which we call the king archetype, the next one is the Hermit Archetype, or the old man archetype. And I might fit into that now because I'm older. My daughters are now close to 40 years old, so if I had a beard, I could probably play Gandalf or someone like that in the movies. I do have lots of gray hair here. And so, but it's typically the wise man archetype, the older man who is no longer leading a household, but he provides his wisdom to the family. On the female side, also there's the child archetype, of course, but the child archetype for women very soon leads to the Venus archetype, where the woman wants to feel beautiful and look beautiful and look very attractive to men. She wants to attract attention of men, and that's a very typical Aphrodite or Venus archetype situation. In mythology, we have the images that have been painted of Aphrodite rising out of the waves. I'll show you a picture of Aphrodite here in a few minutes when I talk about archetypes in art and how understanding archetypes can actually help you make your art more successful and be more interesting to people. And as a matter of fact, I'll talk about that in just a minute as soon as I go through these last two on the women's side, or three. So first is typically is the child, and then the Venus archetype for women who are attracting a mate. And then the next archetype is the mother archetype. And so women very often have children, and the instinctual aspects of being a mother come into gear, and she becomes a mother figure to whatever her child is. And then she becomes the queen. She's the head of the household on the female side. She's her husband's partner, and together they're reigning in this kingdom of the household, the family unit. And so that's the very typical instinctual archetypal queen level. And then finally is the wise woman stage, which is like the wise man stage. She becomes older woman with grown children, and she has lots of wisdom based on probably many mistakes that were made during her lifetime. Obviously, the wise man has made very many mistakes too, because that's how we become conscious. And those are the very typical tip of the iceberg type of archetypes that Dr. Jung talked about. And I want to talk just a minute about archetype and art, because this is how I first really got interested in this. And in art, I used to go to adult painting classes, and when I did, I was sort of appalled in a way that there would be a still life that people were painting in the class, and most of the people in the class would be sitting there trying to make a photographic image of the bowl of fruit. And the problem with that is that we have cameras for that now. And so it's not really necessary in this day and age for people to replicate a bowl of fruit, and it really has very little meaning. And what's more important, perhaps, is that the artist represents a message from the unconscious of the artist, who is saying something about his time or place, or her time or place, and it's being conveyed to the conscious mind of the viewer. And so, to give you a few examples, this sculpture is Aphrodite of Rhodes. And the thing about this particular sculpture is, for my family, it's also a symbol, because in the 1950s, or late 40s, my father was on a U.S. Navy ship, and he went to Greece, and he was able to purchase a copy of this sculpture in Rhodes, and this is Aphrodite of Rhodes. Now, a couple of significant things in general about Aphrodite of Rhodes is that she was done nearly 2,000 years ago. She was found in the 20th century in the harbor of Rhodes, Greece, and they've found about 3,000 sculptures on the island of Rhodes over the years, but this is a very famous one, and so they do sell copies of it. My father had purchased a copy of it, brought it back to my mother, who was then a very young mother. My brother, I had a brother and a sister that were younger than me, and my brother was just maybe a year old, so my mother would have been perhaps 28 years old. And my father gave my mother this sculpture as a gift from being away for 3 months on deployment. And the first night that it was in the house, she put it on a telephone stand in the hallway of our apartment, and my brother crawled over to the telephone stand and shook the table, and down came Aphrodite of Rhodes and broke into many, many pieces. My mother was shattered by this experience, and even I, who was only perhaps 3 at the time, I remember the great clamor about this situation. And my mother stayed up all night gluing Aphrodite of Rhodes back together again. And she put it back on the telephone stand, and the very next day, my brother again crawled up to the telephone stand and pulled on the leg, and down it came again and broke into 1,000 pieces. And so in terrible shock, my mother swept it up and threw it away. 54 years later, my wife and I were going to visit Athens. at the time of the Athens Olympics in 2004. And I asked my mother if there's anything that she could, that I could bring her. And I had forgotten this incident, but she told me about it and told me that story. And she described this sculpture to me as a woman combing her hair with her hand up like that. That's how she was describing it to me. So when I was in Athens, I looked around, and the shopkeeper said, well, that can only be one sculpture. And so sure enough, he pulled it out, and he had two of them, actually. I bought both of them, and I brought one home to my mother 54 years later. And you can see that in my unconscious, this is quite emotional for me, and it brings tears to my eyes to even tell this story. But in any case, in art, the artist is telling us something about the beauty of the feminine form 2,000 years ago. And so even though he lived 2,000 years, he can express to us today what he thought of this woman who was his model. And then the next one is Michelangelo. I mean, art is, and Michelangelo did David. This is the statue of David in Rome. And of course, I had to give equal time to the feminine side, but I remember a humorous photograph I saw once, and in that photograph there are four nuns. I'm going to fold this back so you can see this image. There were four nuns, and they have their back to their camera. They're facing David, and they're pointing up at David. And there's a caption on that photograph that says, I don't know what it is about him, but I know what I like. and that kind of expresses the idea of the archetype, actually, because a woman will naturally tend to like, in most cases, a male nude, and a male will usually like a female nude. Obviously, we know there are exceptions to that, but in the larger sense, and all of that is archetypal. So, if you want to paint a picture that you can sell, you might want to think about painting a picture of David or of Aphrodite. Okay, now there's a couple of other interesting aspects of this. One is Jackson Pollock, who I went to the Boston Museum of Art once, and I don't typically get very emotional going to art galleries. I know a lot of people who do go to art galleries, and they come out in tears, and they're in tears the whole time they're there. And the reason is that the art is causing an emotional reaction from the audience. But that doesn't happen to me very often. But on this particular day, I went to the Boston Museum of Art, and it so happened that there was a Jackson Pollock there. And I have always seen a picture Jackson Pollock had painted. This is one of his famous drip paintings. And looking at it in a photograph like this, I was never very moved by it. But I saw this particular painting on the wall of the Boston Museum of Art, and it's about 20 feet wide and 10 feet high. And I looked at it, and suddenly I just burst into tears. And I don't know why, but I know that there's something very significant and archetypal about it. And it was a message going directly from Jackson Pollock's unconscious, because he painted these in an unconscious way, trying to bring up something from his own unconscious. So it was a message directly from Jackson Pollock's unconscious to my unconscious. Now, I don't know whether that's good or bad in this case, because Jackson Pollock had a very difficult life. He died in an automobile accident when he was 44, I believe, or 42, and he was an alcoholic. And so it's not entirely clear whether he was mentally balanced, honestly. And the thing is about this and why I might have reacted to it, it's either that it was a very beautiful experience or it was me bursting into tears of grief over how horrible his life was at depth. And I don't know which it is, but it could be either one. And so I've always thought about that, but it's one of two things that I've ever seen in a museum that really affected me personally. And the other thing that I was very affected by was this piece. And I don't know if you can see it well, but this is a table and chairs, ordinary table and chairs, but it was put together at 3 times normal size. And so you can see the woman sitting in the chair here, and she looks like a child. And when I saw this at the at the Boston Museum of Art, it was by itself in a room. And so you walked into the room, and immediately you were under the table. And instantly you felt like you were 3 years old. Okay, just instantly, the feeling of being a 3-year-old and being under your parents' table came over you. And I was extremely impressed by that experience. Now, also in poetry, there are a lot of archetypal ideas because poetry tends to, poetry typically uses symbolism to express a thought. And it so happens that years ago I was reading a book about what women dream. And so women dream archetypal things. That's what happens with dreams. Dreams are messages from your unconscious to your conscious mind. And I had read this book, and the next day I was going to give a poetry reading, but I sat down and this poem popped out of my mind in 45 minutes. And it's full of symbolism. We'll talk about that more next week when we talk about man and his symbols. But I'm going to read it to you very briefly here, and you'll see what I mean. The poem is called The Whale and the Horse. And interestingly, the next day, when I gave my reading, it was at the Martin Luther King Library in Washington, D.C., and I didn't know who the audience would be. And on the day, it turned out that the audience was about 50 homeless men, mostly black, and they had come in out of the cold, and the library had set up chairs in rows for my reading. And so I read my poems. And of all my poems, this is the only one that they asked me to reread. And the only change I made to the poem was, because my audience was almost all black, I changed the color of the horse from white to black. But otherwise, I read it as it is. And these, as I say, these indigent black men were obviously touched by this, even though what I was talking about was archetypally in women's dreams, typically. So it's called The Whale and the Horse. I dreamed I was a mighty whale, and you a majestic white horse, who lived on an arid plain so stale, you couldn't find life's source. My habitat was a blue-green cove, where I often swam and dove, and though our forms were sealed by fate, we found we could communicate. You often came to a cliff edge where you could see me swim. You found a path beyond the ledge where you followed your precious whim, to step gingerly down the path through thorns to my white sand beach, where you could touch my warm, moist bath, allowing me to teach of joys of life and joys of love from many years ago, beyond the strife of thorns above, in precious realms below. But when I looked at your foreleg, I saw a bloody stream of bright red ooze from thorny peg, nightmare within a dream. I bade you join my moist pleasure, but you couldn't stand the sting. I gave the secret of my treasure, the balm for which men sing. Your hooves dug deep, you wouldn't weep. You found my amber ball. You stove it in, released within, its vapor raised the pall. Now free to run and have some fun, you galloped in the surf. You ducked your head into the foam, then dove into my turf. We swam and dove inside my cove, until on one deep dive, we surfaced for breath, defeating death, and flew up alive. We flew above your Arab plain and dripped our splashing waters, and everywhere our bodies dripped, the trees gave birth to daughters. We cavorted nearly every day until the plain was lush, and then returned unto the bay, where we found your belly plush, with the fruits of love's wisdom transcending our kingdom of time and space we all know. Our child brought our freedom to fathom the wisdom of leaving life's flow to love's flow. Now, one of the reasons that I think this poem is particularly apt is because the child of the whale and the horse, obviously in the physical world, there can be no such child, and there never would be. But Dr. Jung's work was about the psyche. And so in our psychic thought, we could imagine that there is such a thing as a cross between a horse and a whale. And we might think what that would mean. It might be good, it might be bad, I don't know. But Dr. Jung spent a lot of time talking about alchemy in his career. And one of the fundamental ideas of alchemy is to bring two different substances together. They can't mix for some reason, like the whale and the horse cannot have a child. But in the psyche, something new can be born. And that new thing may be something wonderful. It may be something devilish, who knows? But that's what alchemy really was about in terms of what people were doing 1,500 years ago. And they said they were trying to make gold, but the gold that they were trying to make was the gold of the heart. And so they talked in symbols and different signs so that they wouldn't be burned at the stake. And about 300 years after the last alchemy class was taught at a university in Europe, Dr. Jung discovered that these were really early psychologists, and they really had a lot of very good ideas. And so that's one of the interesting aspects of Dr. Jung's work. Now, before I go into a lot of other ideas, I do want to mention one thing, and that is the famous Red Book, which has become very famous since it was published in 2009. And the Red Book is this volume. It's quite huge, as you can see. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, my camera seems to be reversing the words. But Dr. Jung kept the Red Book. After he broke up with Dr. Freud, he had a psychic event that occurred to him personally. And so because he was a psychiatrist himself and knew what was happening, he decided to note it down, and he was able to keep connection with his own life. And over a period of 16 years, he noted down all the things that happened to him during a 5-year period when he had tremendous visions and what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. And the Red Book is the produce of that. And he said about it, "The years of which I have spoken to you, when I pursued the inner images, were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life, but the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then." And I brought along this volume of the Red Book just so I could give you a quick sense of it. He wrote in his own calligraphy hand, and so here he's written in German and all in calligraphy, and then he did all of the paintings that are in this book. And the paintings are available online. If you just put in Carl Jung Red Book paintings, you can see many of them, but they're very dramatic paintings. And so there's one. And let me see if I can find a couple more that are particularly noteworthy. These were mandalas that he did. And here's a beautiful mandala that he painted. And so he put that in the Red Book. And we'll talk about mandalas and what they mean at a later time. And here we have someone who's been struck through the heart with a ray of some sort. And next to him, you can see he's got a snake with him. Okay, and so the snakes are very significant in the unconscious, and many people have dreams of snakes. But then there are dreams like this, which have Egyptian calligraphy and that sort of thing in them. And unfortunately, this book is really too expensive for most people to buy as a first thing. And there is, besides the 200 pages in this that are devoted to the German calligraphy, it's actually a photographic plate of what Dr. Jung wrote. There is a terrific introduction in it, about 100 pages, and then a full translation of the Red Book into English so that we can understand what it is. And so in order for average people to have connection with this, they published a reader's edition. And this is only about, that big book is about $150, but this book in Amazon is about $25, so that you can get all the words in English from the main Red Book, but you don't have any of the images in this version, no images. And you see how I read Dr. Jung is I'm often putting tabs on pages, and I strictly underline. I haven't done any underlining in the main Red Book, but I have done in my reader's edition. And so let's see. I think before we get too controversial, I'm going to talk about the first book that we'll use in this reading group, and that's this book, Man and His Symbols. And so you can get your own copy of Man and His Symbols from Amazon or from your local bookstore. Most bookstores carry it. I really prefer the larger color plate edition, which is about this big as opposed to this paperback size. But the paperback does have the images in it. Unfortunately, they're all in black and white, so you don't really get an appreciation of what he's talking about necessarily. But the concepts are there, and so beginning next week, we'll start by talking about the introduction to this book and about the first 20 pages or so. And I'll start talking about that next week. The significance of this book is that late in his life, Dr. Jung had never really focused on the general public. He had been a psychiatrist and psychologist through his life. He had been taking patients right along and was corresponding with them right up to the month before he died when he was 85. And so the result was that there was not much that he thought was there for the layman. I actually happen to think differently, that you can read and understand Dr. Jung's work, but it's not easy. It's something that you have to work at. And so, but late in his life, in the late 1950s, the BBC did a interview of Dr. Jung, and in that interview, or after that interview was broadcast, Dr. Jung got many letters from average people. And the result was that Dr. Jung had a dream. And in that dream, he saw himself as communicating with a great auditorium of people. He's envisioned something perhaps like the UN or something like that, the General Assembly of the UN. And he envisioned that he would be talking to a great throng of people from all over the world. And of course, he was too old. He actually finished his part of this book only 10 days before he died. But because of that dream, he envisioned writing a book that was directed to the layman. And it so happens that I bought the plated version of the book in about 1990. And over a period of 1 year, I read it very slowly at about 3 or 4 pages a night, just before I went to sleep each night. And at the end of the year, I felt as if I had had a year's worth of psychotherapy, even though I never did have any psychotherapy. And so I was very impressed by that. And because he intended this book for the layman, I thought it's the right place to begin a Carl Jung reading group. And I hope you'll follow along with me, at least for the next few weeks. I'm here at a Buddhist center in Annapolis, Maryland, and I'll be here for a while in the hopes that I'll actually get a physical person to come. That hasn't happened tonight, and so I'm speaking to my one listener on Periscope this evening, and I hope this has been an informative time for you. But anyway, a little bit more about Man and His Symbols. So Dr. Jung wrote the first section of this book himself, and it's about approaching the unconscious. And then 3 of his key followers also wrote passages, and they wrote about they wrote about mythology, they wrote about the process of individuation, which I spoke of earlier, which is the process of you learning to be what you were intended to be when you were born. There was actually programming in you that intended you to be something. And every living creature, whether a plant or an animal, has that rhizome, that intention to be something. And so every oak tree is a unique oak tree, and every human being is a unique human being. And the purpose of depth psychology is for you to learn how to be all you can be. And so that's the process of individuation. And then the fourth part is symbolism in the visual arts. And we've talked a little bit about that tonight, but we'll talk about it in more detail. There's about 80 pages of this book that's dedicated to symbolism in the visual arts. And then finally, there's a section called Symbols in an Individual Analysis, in which Yolanda Jacobi, who was one of Dr. Jung's closest disciples, writes about a specific analysis and takes us through it so that we understand what follows. And so I hope you'll follow along with me and join me each week for the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. And I intend to be broadcasting this live on Periscope for as long as I possibly can. I just believe I'm not a therapist, and I never intend to be one. This is about using Dr. Jung's work for other things other than psychotherapy. And I use it in my study of American politics. I wrote a book called Political Psychology, New Ideas for Activists. And you can find that book, which I published in 2014, on Amazon. And because Dr. Jung has informed me very well on what's going on in American politics, and I seem to be one of the few people in the United States who understands what's happened to us in 2016. I think that it's important for all of us to understand these things. So I hope you'll follow along with this, and I look forward to seeing you next Monday night. Next Monday night we will again convene at 8:15 Eastern Daylight Time, and again we'll be here at the Gampopa Center in Annapolis, Maryland, in Eastport. And if you can join us live, I would love to have the interaction. But if you can't, that's why I'm doing this on Periscope, so that you can follow along with the reading group, and hopefully we'll build a good following over time. So thank you for listening, and thank you for coming to the first session of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. Talk to you soon.